And my scripture today is from Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Then Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." And that ends the reading of our scripture, Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Have you ever felt as though the burden is just too heavy to carry, feeling tired and weary? In our lesson today, the master teacher is teaching us there's another way. And his option is not a heavy burden. Actually, it will lighten our load. He presents us with the option to yoke or bind ourselves to God and to the spirit of the Christ consciousness within us. And he tells us that here we will find rest for our souls. In deep meditation, we feel yoked to God and our spirit. And when we do this, we feel refreshed, renewed. Sometimes in this busy world, that can be challenging. It can be challenging to carve out time for our meditation. And when we do, sometimes it's difficult to hear the inner voice amidst all the chatter and chaos going on within us and all around us. The outside world becomes so noisy. It's difficult to hear our own thoughts. And more importantly, it can be difficult to hear our inner voice. When we are disconnected from the source, or our connection is weak, our burden may feel heavy and unbearable. How strong is our connection? Or, should I say in today's terms, how strong is our signal with God? The more clutter and interference we have going on inside of our head, it can weaken this signal. And when our signal is weak, it becomes more challenging because we are navigating through our day without our GPS. When we get off course, then it's like that snowball that can begin to roll. We may lose hope and faith, feeling as though we are lost in the wilderness and not quite sure how we find our way back home. The key to maintaining this strong signal is to always stay connected to God. How often Is your iPhone disconnected from the internet? I'd be willing to say probably never. We want to discipline ourselves to block out all the irrelevant chatter so we can hear, to quiet the noise in our head and all around us, regardless of what is going on in our lives. I cannot stress enough the importance of carving out the time in our day, even if it is for only 10 minutes, to find our quiet space and can consciously connect to the source. Because when we do so, we are not only connected to the source of the capital G of God all around us, what else are we connected to? We're connected to the small g of the God within us. And the small g of the God in us, that's our internal GPS. It'll help us throughout the day. So we always want to remain connected to it. Because it's when we lose our connection that we may begin to feel lost and overburdened. Because we can't hear. We can't hear the guidance that we need. Years ago, I began reading the book, The Second Coming of Christ, by Paramahansa Yogananda. And in his book, Yogananda spoke about being able to live in the noise of the city and still maintaining our spiritual peace and connection. And this spoke to me because some of us, we live in the city. We're not living up in a top of a mountain in a monastery somewhere. He said, it is easy to maintain our spiritual peace when we are living at the top of that mountain in a monastery where the world or our world is void of the noise and the daily interferences. But it can be much more challenging to maintain our spiritual peace when we are living in the noise of the city. And as I mentioned, it really spoke to me. I found it interesting that not everyone was meant to live a monastic life. Some of us are meant to live in the city. Now, living in the city is more challenging, but we can find our spiritual peace by learning to block out all the noise, becoming the master of our world instead of allowing the world to overcome us. And once we establish this strong signal, all the noise in the world won't diminish it. And as a side note, I just want to mention that his book, The Second Coming of Christ, it's not about the reincarnation of Jesus. Rather, The second coming is the realization of our own Christ consciousness. Meditation is how we yoke ourselves to God and realize our peace in the inner stillness. So we may not just listen, but that we actually hear. Hearing the music behind the music. Pushing ourselves beyond the physical layers to the deep, deep spiritual layers. Going higher and going deeper. Diving beyond the thoughts of our mind, where we are immersed in the pure, radiant consciousness of God. Hearing with our spiritual ears. Now, there are many different meditation techniques to get us there. And once you find the technique that works for you, just do it. Just do it and don't stop. If you are having difficulty finding the stillness, there are several techniques you can use to recenter yourself and quiet the mind. You may try using your breath or a mantra. And what these do is this redirects the mind to bring the focus from the outer world to within, to the breath or mantra instead of our thoughts. And as we do, eventually the thoughts begin to fade into nothingness. And if the thoughts start to creep back in, that's okay. Just bring it back to within. In meditation, you also want to center your attention on the area of the third eye. As you breathe in, as we did today, you may say to yourself, God is, and on the exhale, I am. You can allow this breath and mantra to quiet the mind as you turn inward, continuing to focus your gaze toward the light of God streaming in through your third eye or crown chakra, repeating whatever mantra you use until you find the silence. And there, just immerse yourself in God. When we overcome the noise and the chaos of the city, we will realize our spiritual peace. And in our mind, we will be spiritually high atop the mountain, lined with God, and we will find rest for our souls. And when we reach the top of that mountain, no one or nothing can take it from us. We recently attended a Kriya Yoga meditation retreat down in Georgia. And similar to our scripture, where it teaches us to yoke ourselves to God, the word yoga means to bind. And in the Kriya Yoga tradition, we are taught to yoke or bind ourselves to self and God realization. And similar to what we do in Kriya Yoga, this is done through super conscious meditation, which is focused on our union with God. And as we do, we awaken to the truth of who we are. Roy Eugene Davis, who was ordained by Yogananda and dedicated his life to teaching Kriya Yoga, said, "I am very awake, and I awaken more every day." His words were profound. I'm going to repeat that again. I am very awake, and I awaken more every day. Powerful words. I encourage you to take this into your consciousness. Kriya Yoga teaches us we want to purify the mind and the ego to make space for the spiritual awakening. For some of us, there are some physical things that may stand in our way. Now, keep in mind, it is not God who awakens us, but rather we are awakening ourselves. It is when we feel we are separate from God, or when the ego gets in the way, that we may be derailed from our awakening. And during the retreat, the teacher shared with us some factors that may contribute to the ego having a false sense of self and separateness. And as I contemplated his lessons, I identified with so much of what he was saying. And that light went off. I understood how my spirit was being weighed down. And while I was there, I meditated daily to identify what I needed to release so I can awaken even more. It was a silent retreat, and we spent 4 to 5 hours a day in meditation. It was a deep dive into super conscious meditation, and it was a wonderful opportunity to make this space my life for my own awakening. I felt like a new person when I drove off the retreat grounds. One of the keys to awakening even more is to identify what may be holding us back and dissolving any blockages. Sometimes we hold on to past experiences and they become so ingrained, they may even create a bias. And some of these past experiences can be traumatic and hard to look at. And they impact how we think and how we feel. And soon we find ourselves carrying around this big, heavy suitcase filled with these things. And because we don't empty it, the suitcase becomes bigger and heavier until we take the time to empty it. And if we're not careful, this little suitcase is going to turn into a giant trunk. And soon we can't lift it any longer. There we feel burdened because it's just too overwhelming to tackle it all. When we stuff our emotions and past traumatic experiences, they don't go away. All they do is simmer. They simmer deep, deep within us. We found this special place to keep them packed. And while it may be painful and challenging, the teacher presented us with the idea of allowing these things to bubble to the surface and look at them. And he said, we want to resolve to dissolve, to resolve to dissolve, allowing these things to bubble up. And yes, it can be hard sometimes. But what's the option? Because when we stuff them back down, they don't go away. Sometimes they can begin to fester. But once we face the monsters under our bed, what happens? They begin to lose power over us. We yoke or bind ourselves to God to give us the strength that we need, the strength to face and dissolve them. And little by little, the trunk begins to shrink to a suitcase. And one day we wake up and realize our suitcase is empty. And when that suitcase is empty, boy, our spirit is free to fly. It's free to fly because we are no longer restricted by this heavy, heavy load we've been carrying. And it no longer affects the way we think or see the world. So, I ask you, which burden is heavier? Carrying a trunk full of our past hurts, regrets, and traumatic events? Or facing the monsters under our bed and dissolving them until they no longer have power over us? The master teacher taught us. He's there for us. These teachings are there to help us. And if we take his yoke upon us, we will find rest for our souls. When we turn to God and ask, we will be given the help we need. I want to mention two other points that he brought up, which were attachment and clinging. And I've touched on practicing non-attachment before, but I want to dive back into it today. Attachment identifies to our physical world. What are we attached to? And what do we identify with? As I mentioned, in those hours of meditation, what came to me was my work. For me, I've been blessed to have a 40-year career. Yes, 40 years with my current employer, but I'm still 20. I love what I do. Because I love it so much, I pour my heart and my soul into my work. And well, maybe perhaps a little too much, which can be to my detriment. I'm grateful it has provided for a roof over my head, for food up on my table. But I have come to realize that I am very attached to it as part of my identity. No, I'm not going to quit my job tomorrow. I can change my perspective and I can loosen my attachment. My work provides for me, but it is not who I am. Because who I am is a spiritual being. What are you attached to? A job? A relationship? Old thought patterns that are no longer serving you? Regrets? Perhaps believing we are lesser than. If we don't have what society believes we should have. And things will come and go, and these things will come and go. So, first and foremost, we want to be attached to God. And once we're attached to God, everything we need will be provided. Another thing he spoke about was clinging. When we cling to who and what we were, clinging to a false sense of worthiness, perhaps feeling as though others have to validate who we are and seeking their approval, clinging to who we were in our youth. Well, when I was younger, I looked like this or I looked like that. Our youth may fade over time, but there's a big but coming. Our wisdom grows over time. And we don't need anyone to validate us. And our sense of worthiness is not on the surface. Our sense of worthiness comes from deep within us, from that beautiful spirit that we are. It comes when we identify from the spirit within us, because we are the precious light of God, kind, loving, compassionate, so that we may fully awaken. We want to remove any obstacles or obstructions, whatever they may be. And for each of us, they're different. We also want to create conditions in our life so that we may easily go into the silence and experience the peace of our soul. And in this space, awaken even more, yoking ourselves to God and to our Christ consciousness, binding ourselves to self and God realization. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest in your souls. Namaste.